It is recording now. So to start again, this is a session on the techniques to survive the holidays. So how best can you do it? Now, we are a fasting group, and fasting is a very powerful technique. And I'm going to talk about the tricks that I teach my patients, 6 tricks. So 6 tricks that I teach my patients how to survive the holidays. So first trick, many times when you feel that your hunger is coming, that you are getting an urge to eat without which you would physically feel bad. In other words, it's a very important aspect. You decided you wanted to fast until a certain time during the day, or you are in a multi-day fast. And you come to a point at which you feel that there is a physical need for some food. In other words, just not cravings that are related to the sight and smell of food, but you actually physically feel somewhat not very good. This could be either because of a low blood pressure, because you're not eating. You can have a decrease in your blood volume, your blood pressure may go down, your heart rate may speed up a little bit, and you're physically not feeling good. So the first trick for that would be to take a pinch of salt and put it underneath your tongue, or take a glass of water, use a little less than 1/4 teaspoon of salt in it, mix it. You can add a little lemon to give it a good taste. Lemon may not be so good for people who have a bit of acid reflux, but if you don't have that, by all means, add the lemon. And that little amount of salt is going to make you feel good. So that's the number 1 trick. Number 2 trick, availability is the way you would describe it. If you have bad food available in your house, you're going to consume it. And bad food is sugary, processed, baked, all kinds of foods that have simple and refined carbs in it. Now, I grant you that during the holidays, it might be very difficult not to have that kind of food in your house, because several people are a part of your household and they have different needs and requirements, and they don't have the same goals as you have. But even for them, having the right type of food is important. So if you are a head of a household, if you're a part of the family, you can make an argument that what is good for you is also good for them. So when you stock your fridge, when you stock your pantry, you may try to make choices that are high quality protein, high quality vegetables, non-processed, non-sugary food as much as possible. So the first one was salt. The second one was availability. Availability is a very important aspect of not cheating and sustaining your goals, whether it is fasting or sticking to a low carb diet. Now the third the third technique is willpower. Willpower is not that easy at the end of the day. I find that my willpower is very good early in the morning, in the afternoon, but as I'm getting tired, as I'm getting fatigued after a long day of work, willpower does not seem to be very effective, and willpower is present in short supply. So in other words, it's not an infinite resource. And some people say willpower should not be utilized very much, because once you fail with willpower, you will give into temptations a lot more, you will give into cravings a lot more. I think I disagree with them a little bit, because willpower, like anything else, is a muscle. The more you refine it, the better it will become. So let's talk about the more you refine willpower, the more you practice it, the more you sustain it, the better it becomes. I'm not a philosopher by any means, but something that comes to mind is the control of your own body, control over oneself, is perhaps the biggest satisfaction, the biggest aspect of our life that brings about happiness. So in other words, it's not having material possessions, it's not having many things, but I think that the two things that would bring a significant degree of happiness is health and having control over yourself. And one aspect of having control over yourself is to be able to practice the habit of willpower. So technique number 1, salt. Technique number 2, availability. Technique number 3 was willpower. Now, technique 4, I think that this is by far the most effective and the most important one that I can give to anyone. The best way to describe technique 4 is to talk about Stanford marshmallow experiment. So the Stanford marshmallow experiment was an experiment done in late 1960s by a certain scientist. He put preschool children and he put them in a room with an instructor. The instructor put a marshmallow on the table in front of them and said, I will be back in 10 minutes. If you don't eat this marshmallow, I'm going to give you 2. A large proportion of kids could not resist the temptation and ate the marshmallow. A small proportion of kids did not eat that marshmallow. And when this small proportion of kids were followed later in years, they were a lot more successful. They had higher education. They had higher income levels. When you distill down and find out how these kids did not eat the marshmallow, and there are several different interpretations of that, the interpretation that I like the best is that these kids were practicing a technique called distraction. They distracted themselves from the marshmallow. The marshmallow was in front of them and they said, I'm going to think about playing a game with my friend. They visualized being somewhere else. In other words, they took their mind off the marshmallow. So this is the most effective and the strongest technique that you can inculcate. And for me, that technique is to go ahead and clean my bikes. Say, I'm hungry, I want to cheat, I feel like a craving is coming on. What I do is I remove myself from that, take my bike and start cleaning it up, polishing it up, putting wax on it, cleaning up the wheels, repairing some simple things. And you would be amazed that this technique of distraction would take your mind away from the craving. And then you would no longer be able to give in to that craving that is right in front of you. So I urge you to find your own distraction. It could be walking away from where people are eating to a different location, to read a book, to watch your to hear your favorite podcast, to look at your favorite YouTube video about something else. So know what your distraction is ahead of time. Practice it in your mind so that you can incorporate into it. Okay, so the 4 techniques so far: salt, availability, willpower, the Stanford marshmallow experiment, which is basically describing distraction. Now let's talk about the 5th. Now there's several questions that are coming up here, and I will get to those questions in a little bit, but I want to give you guys the techniques of surviving the holidays first. So the fifth one is best described as fasting begets fasting. In other words, fasting is difficult at about 12 hours, at about 15 hours. But as you progress in the fasted state, fasting becomes easier. Why is that the case? The reason that is the case is that the more time you are away from eating, the more fat burning you become, and the more ketones you're making. So your vulnerable period, the period in which you're likely to give in to temptations, is perhaps somewhere between 8 and 16 to 18 hours. So in that time frame, you may have to use different techniques, but if you are coming up to 18th hour, one of the things that I tell my patients is get into the habit of checking your ketones. So your fifth technique is fasting begets fasting, and you're going to reinforce that by checking your ketone levels. So checking your ketone levels means that, let's say you are at 18th hour and your ketone is 1 millimole per liter. That means that you've already started fat burning, that you have enough fat energy in your bloodstream that you do not necessarily need to eat. So getting into the habit of checking ketones might reinforce your ability to fast. You would say, hey, I have come up to about 18 hours and my ketones are already there. I can push it. And as I push it, my ketone levels will go higher. I will have enough energy in my bloodstream and I don't need to give up my fast. Now, an important aspect here to discuss. The ability to make ketones can be messed up very easily by indiscretions. So in other words, let's say I want to do a fast, but if I eat high amounts of refined carbs and sugary treats, my insulin will spike way up. And when the insulin spikes up, it immediately abolishes fat burning. It will stop ketone body production. High insulin level stores fat. It does not mobilize fat into the bloodstream. The fat that is there is taken up by the liver and recycled and exported back as triglycerides inside cholesterol and triglyceride-rich lipoprotein. And that is not really available as fuel for us. It's not taken up by the liver, it's not taken up by the muscle and used for energy. So high insulin states are anabolic from the standpoint of packing fat into the fat cells. And the more refined carbs you eat and the more refined and processed food, especially sugary treats, the spike in insulin is going to make it harder and perhaps a little longer for you to get into ketosis. And especially when the insulin goes up, it's going to drop your sugar down after a certain period of time and going to make you feel hungry again. So here is another important aspect that you want to practice, which is that if you are getting ready to eat, you may want to first eat the fat, first eat the protein, and not eat the refined carbs and the refined sugar. Make that towards the end of your meal so that the spike in insulin is not quite as high. Okay. 5 tricks we have talked about: salt, availability, willpower, the Stanford marshmallow experiment describing distraction. The fifth is fasting begets fasting and how to use ketones in that. Now let's talk about the sixth trick. Now the sixth trick is a combination trick. The first part of that may or may not be necessary. So the first part of that is caffeine. Now caffeine increases the mobilization of fat from the fat cells. In other words, caffeine activates a certain hormone in the fat cells that breaks down triglycerides, which is a fat molecule with glycerol attached to it. So there'll be 3 fatty acid chains with a backbone of glycerol out here. So this enzyme, in the presence of caffeine, breaks the glycerol from the fatty acids. The fatty acids are released into the circulation. Mobilization of fatty acids happens with caffeine. Now, caffeine, even though it mobilizes the fatty acid, it doesn't promote fatty acid oxidation. In other words, mobilization is different than burning of fat. Fatty acid oxidation is using fat for fuel. Caffeine does increase the fatty acid oxidation, but only by a small amount. Mobilization is great, oxidation is not that much. Now, caffeine does one other important aspect, and that is that it increases thermic energy. In other words, you're generating some heat. So as fuel, whether it is glucose or carbs, whether it is proteins or whether it's fat, in order to make usable energy, that fuel goes through the mitochondria. Mitochondria are the engines of the cell. So the mitochondria take the fuel, and as they are processing the fuel in them, they produce usable currency called ATP. ATP is energy currency. What caffeine does is that it partly uncouples the process. So it uncouples the movement of these nutrients, whether it's carbs or fat or protein, through the mitochondria to make energy currency. It uncouples it. It's calling uncoupling of producing ATP, and the uncoupling process generates heat. So thermic energy of caffeine will burn some fuel. So caffeine does increase fat oxidation, but not by a lot. It does cause a little thermic energy, so you are burning some fuel, literally burning it to produce heat and not producing ATP. But the predominant effect of caffeine is to mobilize fat from the fat cells as fatty acids. So how can you take that and start burning the fatty acids? So if you drink a cup of caffeine, it increases your epinephrine level. Epinephrine level gives you energy. You take that energy, you already have extra fuel in your bloodstream, and you start exercising. When you do caffeine and when you do exercise, several things are going to happen. You're going to increase the amount of fatty acids released into the bloodstream because exercise does the same thing, but there's an augmentation from 2 processes. Exercise is very good at increasing the oxidation of fat. So in other words, fatty acids are released into the bloodstream. Exercise makes you oxidize fat in your exercising muscles, and hence you are emptying your fat cells. You are using the fat for energy. Excellent. Now, after you finish exercise, if you immediately eat, this oxidation of fatty acids is going to stop. So if you create a time interval between the end of exercise and your first meal, let's say that's 4 hours, let's say that's 6 hours, in some cases, let's say that's 10 hours. In this time frame, you continue to burn fat in the muscles, you continue to release fatty acids into the bloodstream. And because your insulin levels are low, in other words, you have not eaten anything, you've finished exercise, your insulin levels take a dip. At this time, the liver takes the fatty acids and converts them to ketones. So your ketone production after you finish exercise is going to exponentially rise. And the rise in your ketone levels is going to be able to feed your brain with fuel. So let us see how this looks like for different people. Like for me, I get up in the morning. Now, black coffee is not essential. In other words, the caffeine that you drink has to be black. If you put sugar and if you put fat into it, you're not going to be able to burn the fat that you're mobilizing from your fat cells. You're going to first have to burn the fat that you have eaten. Emptying your fat cells on a regular basis is one of the most health promoting activities you can do. And the reason for that is that when you eat fat in your meal, the fat cells are empty. They have room to pack in the fat, and fat does not remain in the bloodstream. So caffeine, although a component is not necessary, if you can exercise without caffeine, it probably creates the majority of benefit. Caffeine is a catalyst. It makes it easy. The reason it makes it easy is that caffeine increases your epinephrine levels, the adrenaline levels. That gives you a jolt of energy. You need to use that jolt of energy and begin to exercise. So I think caffeine is a good catalyst, but not necessary for fat burning. You can also take caffeine in green tea, in black tea. So those would also be effective because they do nearly the same thing. But I implore you not to put fat or put sugar in your caffeine. So I get up in the morning, have a cup of black coffee, I get on the bike and I ride my bike to work, which takes anywhere from 30 to 35 minutes, depending on headwinds and stuff like that. Now I continue my work throughout the day, and many times I do not eat my first meal until about 2 o'clock. So from a time period of 7 until 2 is roughly 7 hours, during which time I am promoting fat oxidation, I'm promoting the production of ketones. Now, on important days, at which time I need to function extremely well, like today, I would skip my afternoon meal and have a meal later in the evening at around 7, at around 6, and sometimes today it's going to be perhaps closer to 8:30 or 8 o'clock my time in Houston. Now you could probably alter this in different ways. Like for example, some people like to eat a morning meal, an afternoon meal, and then exercise in the evening. And after they finish exercising, they don't eat all night until the next morning. And that would create the same degree of benefit like I described in the other method. And one of the people who does that, who is very close to me, is my wife. So she is quite often in the habit of exercising in the evening. I like to begin my exercise early in the morning. I also have a bike ride back home after work, which is kind of an exercise too. I do it at lower intensities. So I want to summarize that surviving the holidays, learning these 6 different tricks may help you. And to go over them again: salt, availability, willpower, distraction as described by the Stanford marshmallow experiment, ketones, fasting begets fasting as we talked about measuring ketones, and finally the combination of caffeine and exercise followed by an interval during which you don't eat. So I hope that that was useful, and I'm going to start looking at some of the questions.